I had a number of different questions on this actually come in from different people, like Carol in Arizona, for instance, the question of transgender, and that in a sense, if the sexuality issue has kind of come on apace, I think the transgender issue has more than doubled the in terms of the rapid changes in society and culture. I suspect a lot of that's to do with the sort of technological age we live in and the way things can spread so incredibly fast these days. But rather than comment on specific pastoral issues that some people have written in about, which obviously you're not in a position to really speak into, I did notice that you did sort of put your head above the parapet, let's say, in the Times a year or two ago, commenting on a couple of articles and issues that had come up there. And this was the letter you wrote, and I'd just be interested in you expanding on your comments on this.
Perhaps I should say one of the articles that I was commenting on was by Hugo Rifkind,
yes,
who's son of former Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind. And Hugo, I think, is basically a secularist who's just observing the scene rather than taking a particular moral line.
These were just sort of cultural sort of analysis type pieces. In fact, in whether they filled it in for you or you did, it's mentioned here anyway. Okay. It says, "Sir, the articles by Claire Foges, Gender Fluid World is muddling young minds, and Hugo Rifkind, Social Media is making gender meaningless, and the letters about children wanting to be pandas, dogs or mermaids, show that the confusion about gender identity is a modern and now internet-fueled form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism. The Gnostic, one who knows, has discovered the secret of, quote-unquote, who I really am, behind the deceptive outward appearance, in Rifkin's apt phrase, the ungainly, boring, fleshly one. This involves denying the goodness or even the ultimate reality of the natural world. Nature, however, tends to strike back, with the likely victims in this case being vulnerable and impressionable youngsters who, as confused adults, will pay the price for their elders' fashionable fantasies," you wrote. So, expand that one a little bit. Yes. I mean, you've probably got a little bit of backlash, I'm assuming, on this letter.
I did a little bit. I actually got a bit of whatever the opposite of backlash is, because the Washington Post phoned me up and asked if I'd like to write a whole op-ed piece about it. Okay. And I courteously declined their invitation. I said, what I've written, I've written. I mean, what struck me particularly, again as an ancient historian, was with that article by Rifkind, when he describes people not being satisfied with this boring, fleshly body that they've got and looking inside for a different identity, I thought, I know that stuff. That there's a lot of that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it's very interesting, the rise of Gnosticism in roughly the middle of the 2nd century onwards then chimes in with the fact that Gnosticism has been one of the default American religions, particularly for the last 200 years. Harold Bloom says this in a famous book. In other words, and you find it in Jung and other psychologists, the idea that who I really am is what I discover when I look deep inside my heart. And then I discover, and then if I look at my body, oh dear, this doesn't quite match. Well, we've got to do something about it. And the early Christians were quite clear on two fronts. First, the created order is good and to be redeemed, not to be rejected. Gnosticism is ultimately dualistic.
Right.
Second, with Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things, and who can fathom it? And Jesus says it's out of the heart that there proceed. And then he gives a rather worrying list of things in Mark chapter 7, and he implies that these are the things that defile us. And the problem with Gnosticism is finding my inner identity. And this is the stuff of many, many movies, novels, plays, etc., who I really am.
Yes.
Now, I have known, as we most of us have, some people who have had transgender issues, shall we say. And again, I would stress, this is not something for somebody like me to come down from a great height and say, you're all silly, go away, blah, 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 blah. These are genuine, dear people who one loves and wants to help and affirm and so on. However, as with some other styles of behavior, if I as a pastor see somebody doing something which I deeply and with care believe is really destructive in some way, I need to say something about that. And particularly I worry about children. I have grandchildren now. I worry about them being in a world where somebody might ask, a 7-year-old, do you want to be a boy or a girl? As though this is, and the whole rhetoric of saying, oh, you were assigned that gender at birth, but actually you may be somebody else.
This idea that gender is a purely socially constructed phenomenon.
Socially constructed phenomenon which can be then wished on you by people other than yourself. That's part of what Gnosticism is responding to, is the imperial power of a regime that tells you who you are. And Gnosticism is saying, no, we're different from that.
Right.
It's a protest movement, but it goes inside and protests against its own embodiment.
It's an interesting one, because this stuff is all moving so fast anyway.
Sure.
I think even in the secular postmodern world, people are coming up against certain consequences, let's say,
well, it's happening in the
sporting
world,
yes, where certain female athletes are saying, hang on, I'm all for transgender people, but it doesn't make sense to have people who are physically male competing against women. And indeed, the so-called, trans exclusionary radical feminists, I think is now the term, TERFs. The tradition, the first wave of feminism, Germaine Greer and so on, who are actually saying, well, I've got a problem, and suddenly you've got people who you might expect to be bedfellows actually at odds with each other.
Yes, and I just think that demonstrates the confusion that results from saying that my identity is constituted by some feelings within me about maleness, femaleness, both identity and desire. And it's partly the residual Platonism of Western culture, that we think in terms of the physical being irrelevant, and there's a spiritual reality which is different. And the Bible is very keen on the physical stuff.
So when God said he created the male and female, and he said it was good, there's a givenness, in your opinion, to that identity.
And that, interestingly, in the New Testament, I know that in Galatians 3:28 it says neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male and female. That's because you are all one in Christ. But all the rest of the time, Paul is very much aware that he is a Jew, that other people are not, and we have to navigate that. And in the same way, he is male, some people are female, and we have to navigate that. The fact of being all one in Christ doesn't mean
that we deny any
differences. Yeah, exactly.